You can run to the ends of the earth, Zora, but you're still carrying my blood, and what belongs to me stays with me. She thought she'd escaped him forever. Her husband, Kang Dae-Hyun, the undisputed king of a global shipping and security empire that ran on power, blood, and secrets. They were married once. She walked away, not because she was afraid, but because she refused to be a pawn in his family's endless war for dominance. Now, 7 months pregnant and living in a remote coastal town, she'd built a quiet life on her own terms. One morning shattered everything, because he found her. The man she'd loved once, the man who never learned that love isn't possession. Reality hit him like a freight train when he saw her protective hand cradling her swollen belly. The child was his. But before his men could move, Zora's voice cut through the salt air, devastatingly quiet. "Leave, Dae-Hyun. Pretend you never found me." Welcome to the Silk and Steel Diary, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. What he doesn't realize is that she didn't leave out of weakness. She left because she saw what his empire truly was, and she refused to let it consume their child. What happens when Dae-Hyun drags her back into his fortress, only to discover that the woman he thinks he owns is the only person who's ever truly defied him? Will he learn that control isn't love before he loses her forever? Stay till the end to find out. The armored motorcade looked obscene against the weathered wood porches and wildflower gardens of the coastal town. Black SUVs with tinted windows slicing through the morning mist like predators who'd found their prey. Kang Dae-Hyun stepped out in a tailored black suit, his neck tattoos barely visible above his crisp collar, his expression carved from stone. Then he saw her, Zora, his wife, heavily pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she stood on a small porch overlooking the sea. Her beauty hadn't dimmed, it had transformed into something more powerful. Sun-kissed brown skin, natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a loose linen dress that moved with the ocean breeze. She looked at peace in a way she'd never looked in his penthouse fortress. Their eyes met across the small garden, and something inside him cracked. The woman he'd searched for across 3 continents was standing right here, and everything he thought he understood about power meant nothing in the face of her quiet defiance. 7 months ago, Zora had walked away from the Kang Empire without looking back, not because Dae-Hyun had hurt her directly, but because she'd witnessed what his world truly demanded: the council meetings where violence was currency, the necessary eliminations of anyone who threatened the family's grip on international trade, the blood that stained every dollar, every deal, every smile. When she'd discovered she was pregnant, she'd made a choice. Her child would never grow up in that glass cage, learning that cruelty was strength and love was weakness. So she disappeared, sold the jewelry he draped her in, the designer clothes, everything that connected her to his world. She'd used cash only, no phones, no digital trail. She'd found this small coastal town where tourists came and went, where she could work at a beachside cafe, rent a tiny cottage, and prepare to raise her child in sunlight instead of shadows. The tips were modest but honest. Her savings were dwindling, but her soul was her own. Every morning she woke with her hand on her growing belly, her back aching, her future uncertain, but her heart finally free. Every night she whispered to her baby about the ocean, about peace, about a life where power didn't mean violence.
Kang Dae-Hyun had searched for her. For 7 months, he'd deployed every resource his empire commanded. Hackers tracked digital footprints that didn't exist. Investigators combed through CCTV footage across Asia. His network of informants turned up nothing. His mother, the matriarch of the council, had smiled with practiced sympathy. "Perhaps she simply didn't want to be found, my son. Some women aren't strong enough for our world." But Dae-Hyun knew different. Zora wasn't weak. She was the strongest person he'd ever met. That's what terrified him. He'd finally found her through old-fashioned detective work, a single transaction traced back months, a medical clinic in a coastal region. And now, here he was, standing in her sanctuary, ready to drag her back to his. Because in Kang Dae-Hyun's world, what was his stayed his, even if she hated him for it, even if it destroyed them both. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum, 70 floors above Seoul, all steel and glass and cold perfection, where every surface gleamed and nothing grew. Zora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand on her belly, watching the city lights blur into constellations below. She hadn't spoken since they'd arrived 6 hours ago, hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't done any of the things Dae-Hyun had braced himself for during the private jet ride back. She'd simply walked into the penthouse, accepted the glass of water his housekeeper offered, and positioned herself by the window, like a statue waiting to be admired. It was driving him insane. Dae-Hyun loosened his tie, the silk suddenly suffocating around his throat. He'd imagined this reunion 1,000 different ways during his 7-month search. Anger he could handle, tears he could soothe with money and promises, even hatred he understood. It was just love turned inside out, still burning. But this glacial indifference was something else entirely. "You need to eat," he said, his voice rougher than intended. The dining table behind them was laden with her favorite dishes, prepared by the chef he'd kept on staff specifically for this moment. Jollof rice the way she'd taught them to make it, plantains, the coconut curry she used to request on quiet Sunday mornings when the empire felt far away. Zora didn't turn around. "I'm not hungry." 3 words, the first she'd spoken since "leave Dae-Hyun" on that porch. He moved closer, his footsteps silent on the imported marble, close enough to see her reflection in the window, her beautiful face empty of everything he'd once been able to read there. Love, frustration, hope, joy, all of it erased, leaving behind something smooth and unreachable. "You need to eat," he continued, trying to sound reasonable, trying to ignore the panic clawing up his spine. "Top obstetrician in Seoul. Whatever you need, prenatal vitamins, specialists, anything." "I had a doctor in the coastal town. She was perfectly adequate." Adequate. The word landed like a slap. Everything in his world was exceptional, the best money and power could command, and she was talking about adequate like it was enough, like his empire meant nothing, like he meant nothing. Dae-Hyun's jaw tightened. "You're home now." Finally, she turned, slowly, deliberately, her dark eyes meeting his without a flicker of emotion. "This was never my home, Dae-Hyun. This is your fortress, your glass cage, your monument to everything I walked away from. You're carrying my child." His hand moved toward her belly, an instinct, a need to touch something real. She stepped back, not dramatically, not with fear or anger, just a simple, efficient movement that put distance between them, and somehow that hurt more than any slap could have. "Yes," she said simply, "she am." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, Seoul hummed with life, millions of people in his empire, and yet the only person he wanted to reach was standing 3 feet away, and might as well have been on another planet. Dae-Hyun had bought this penthouse for her, had designed every detail with her in mind. The open kitchen because she loved to cook, the library because she read voraciously, the eastern exposure because she'd once mentioned loving morning light. He'd given her everything except the one thing she'd actually wanted: freedom. "I won't keep you prisoner," he said, the lie tasting bitter even as he spoke it, "but you're not leaving, not until we figure this out." Zora's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "There's nothing to figure out. You wanted me back, here I am." She spread her arms slightly, a gesture of surrender that somehow felt like victory. "But you can't force me to feel anything. You can't make me love you again. You can't even make me fight you." She turned back to the window, her reflection swallowing his. "So congratulations, Dae-Hyun. You won. I'm in your glass cage. But the woman you married?" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She died the day she realized what your empire really cost." He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, watching her watch the city, and understood with terrible clarity that bringing her back might have been the biggest mistake of his life, because the woman he loved was gone, and all he'd captured was her ghost. The council convened at midnight, as they always did when blood and power intersected.
Dae-Hyun sat at the head of the obsidian table in the underground conference room, 3 levels beneath his corporate headquarters where the real empire conducted its business. 12 faces stared back at him, men and women whose loyalty was purchased with fear and profit in equal measure. His mother, the matriarch, sat to his immediate right, her silver hair immaculate, her expression carved from ice. "The woman is a liability," said Park Jin-soo, his second in command, fingers steepled as he leaned forward. "She disappeared once. She'll try again." "She's carrying the air," he said flatly. "That makes her untouchable." A ripple of glances circled the table. His mother's manicured fingers tapped once against the polished surface, a warning he'd learned to read in childhood. "The child is what matters," she said, her voice silk over steel, "not the vessel carrying it. We need to ensure the bloodline remains pure, uncomplicated. The woman has proven herself unreliable." Dae-Hyun's jaw tightened. "Her name is Zora." "Her name," interjected Councilwoman Lee, her tone clinical, "is irrelevant. What matters is succession. We cannot have an heir raised by someone who ran from this family, who rejected our way of life." She paused, letting the weight settle. "Who might run again, this time with your child." The thought had already crossed his mind 100 times since bringing Zora back. He'd stationed security at every exit, placed trackers in every piece of clothing delivered to the penthouse, ensured his people monitored her every movement. But watching her stand by that window, so distant and untouchable, he knew that all his precautions meant nothing. You couldn't cage a ghost. "What are you suggesting?" His voice came out dangerous, low. Park Jin-soo exchanged a look with the matriarch before answering. "There are facilities, comfortable ones, where she can be monitored throughout the pregnancy, medical supervision, proper security, and after the birth," he spread his hands in a gesture meant to be reasonable, "she would be free to go, with appropriate compensation, of course. The child stays with us." The room went very still. Dae-Hyun felt something cold slide down his spine, something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not for himself, he'd long ago made peace with violence, but for Zora, for what these people, his people, were capable of doing in the name of the empire. "You want to imprison her," he said slowly, "and then take her child." "We want to protect your legacy," his mother corrected, her eyes holding his with the same unwavering authority that had shaped him into the man he was. "She's an outsider, Dae-Hyun. She doesn't understand what we've built, what we've sacrificed to maintain this power. The child deserves to be raised properly, within the family structure, by people who understand the weight of our name." "By people who understand that cruelty is strength," he heard in his mother's unspoken words. "By people who would teach his son or daughter that love is weakness and control is everything. By people exactly like him." And suddenly, he saw it. Saw Zora in that coastal town, her hand on her belly, whispering to their unborn child about peace and sunlight and a life free from shadows. Saw her walking away not because she was weak, but because she'd seen his world clearly and refused to let it poison their baby. She'd been protecting their child from him. No. The word came out harder than he intended. His mother's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise. "Excuse me." If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue bringing these stories to life. Zora stays in the penthouse, under my protection. No facilities, no handlers, no separation from the child after birth. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "She is my wife, the mother of my heir, and anyone who touches her answers to me personally." Park Jin-soo leaned back, calculating. "Dae-Hyun, be reasonable. Your attachment to this woman is clouding your judgment." "My judgment," Dae-Hyun interrupted, his voice dropping to the lethal quiet that had built his reputation, "is that this discussion is over." The matriarch studied her son for a long moment, reading something in his face that made her lips thin with displeasure. You're making a mistake. Sentimentality has destroyed stronger men than you. Then I'll be destroyed. He stood, signaling the meeting's end, but she stays with me. As he walked out, leaving 12 disapproving faces in his wake, Dae-Hyun realized something that should have terrified him. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen someone over the Empire. He just wasn't sure if it was enough to save either of them. The gifts started arriving the next morning, a Cartier necklace first, the diamonds catching Seoul's gray morning light as it lay in its velvet box on the breakfast table. Zora glanced at it once, then returned her attention to the tea she wasn't drinking, watching the steam curl and die in the air. By noon, there were more. A deed to a villa in Jeju Island, her name already on the paperwork. Keys to a Mercedes-Benz, custom ordered in midnight blue, the color she'd once mentioned loving. Designer maternity clothes in her exact size, tags still attached, spread across the guest room bed like an apology written in silk and cashmere. She touched none of it. Dae-Hyun stood in the doorway of the master bedroom that evening, watching her sit by the window in the same linen dress she'd worn from the coastal town. The clothes he'd bought remained untouched, the jewelry still in its boxes, even the credit cards he'd left on the nightstand, black titanium with no spending limit, sat exactly where he'd placed them. "There's an account," he said, his voice careful, controlled. $10 million. It's yours, no strings. Use it however you want. Zora turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. For what? For anything. Everything. He stepped into the room, frustration bleeding into his tone, despite his best efforts. Whatever you need, whatever would make you happy. Happy, she repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. You think money makes people happy. He said, it solves problems. Maybe the problems you understand, but you can't buy back time, Dae-Hyun. You can't purchase a clean conscience. You certainly can't purchase me. He moved closer, drawn by that same magnetic pull that had captured him the first time he'd seen her, years ago, before the Empire had shown her its true face. I'm trying to take care of you, you and the baby. No, she said, her voice soft but absolute. You're trying to make yourself feel better. There's a difference. The words landed like bullets, precise and devastating. Dae-Hyun's hands flexed at his sides, every instinct screaming to do something, fix this, command it back into order the way he commanded everything else in his world. But Zora wasn't a business deal to be negotiated or an enemy to be eliminated. She was the one variable his power couldn't control. What do you want then? The question came out rougher than intended, edged with desperation he couldn't quite hide. Tell me what would make this right. She laughed. A sound so tired and empty, it made something crack in his chest. You're still not listening. I don't want your gifts. I don't want your empire. I don't want your blood money or your guilty conscience wrapped in diamonds. She finally turned to face him fully, her dark eyes holding truths he didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted the man I married, the one who existed before I realized that man was a fiction. I haven't changed. Exactly. The single word carried the weight of 7 months, of every brutal choice she'd witnessed, every necessary cruelty justified in the Empire's name. That's the problem, isn't it? You are exactly who you've always been. I'm the one who changed. I'm the one who woke up. Dae-Hyun felt something dangerous rising in his throat, something that tasted like panic and rage and loss all mixed together. I defended you to the council. They wanted to lock you away, take the baby after it's born. I said no. I chose you. You chose your heir, she corrected quietly. Don't mistake possessiveness for protection. That's not fair. Fair? Her voice finally rose, just slightly, just enough to show the fire still burning beneath that glacial surface. You dragged me back here against my will. You stationed guards at every door. You tracked my every movement like I'm a prisoner. Because that's what I am, Dae-Hyun, a beautifully kept prisoner in your glass tower. She gestured to the gifts surrounding them, the evidence of his desperate attempts to fix what money couldn't repair. "And you think a necklace makes it right? A villa I'll never see? A car I'm not allowed to drive anywhere that matters?" She stood slowly, one hand supporting her lower back, the other cradling her belly. Even heavy with his child, even exhausted and trapped, she moved with a dignity that made his empire feel small and worthless. "Keep your gifts," she said, walking past him toward the bathroom. "Donate them, burn them, I don't care, because the only thing I ever wanted from you, you gave away the day you chose this empire over everything else." The bathroom door closed softly behind her, not slammed, just a quiet boundary he couldn't cross. Dae-Hyun stood alone among the wreckage of his failed attempts, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of things that meant absolutely nothing to the only person whose opinion mattered. He'd built an empire that could move governments and topple economies, but he couldn't buy his way back into his wife's heart. The realization settled over him like ash. Zora dreamed of the night she'd decided to leave, though calling it a dream felt too gentle for the memory that haunted her sleep. 8 months ago, she'd been 3 weeks pregnant, didn't know it yet, had only noticed that her body felt different in ways she couldn't name. Dae-Hyun had been in meetings all day, the kind he never discussed, where men in expensive suits talked in careful euphemisms about problems that needed solving and assets that needed liquidating, as if they weren't discussing human lives. She'd gone looking for him near midnight, wanting to tell him about the strange nausea, the tenderness, the possibility growing inside her that felt like hope. The lower levels of the headquarters were off limits, but she was his wife, and the guards knew better than to stop her. She'd heard the screaming before she'd reached the interrogation room.
In her dream, just like in reality, she stood frozen in that hallway, her hand on the cold steel door, listening to sounds that turned her blood to ice. A man begging, the wet impact of fists meeting flesh, and Dae-Hyun's voice, calm and methodical, asking questions like he was discussing quarterly reports instead of systematically destroying another human being. She'd pushed the door open. She didn't remember deciding to. One moment she was in the hallway, the next she was staring into a nightmare dressed in fluorescent lighting. The man tied to the chair was unrecognizable, his face a canvas of purple and red. Blood pooled on the concrete floor. Dae-Hyun stood over him, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his knuckles split and bleeding, his face utterly empty of emotion. 2 of his men stood nearby, waiting for orders like this was just another day at the office. Because for them, it was. Their eyes had met across that room. She'd seen him register her presence, seen something flicker in his expression, concern maybe, or surprise, but not shame, never shame. Zora. He'd said her name like finding her there was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. "You shouldn't be here." She'd tried to speak, but no words came. Her hand had moved instinctively to her stomach, to the life she didn't yet know was there, as if she could shield it from what she was witnessing. "He stole from us," Dae-Hyun had explained, his tone reasonable, as if that justified everything. "Embezzled $2 million from a shipment account. That money belongs to the families who depend on this empire. I'm just recovering what's ours." The man in the chair had whimpered, and the sound cut through Zora like broken glass. "This is necessary," Dae-Hyun had continued, moving toward her, his bloodied hands reaching out. "You understand that, don't you? We can't show weakness. The moment we do, everything we've built collapses." She'd stepped back, away from his touch, away from the man she'd thought she'd married. What happens to him after? A pause, too long, too telling. He'll be handled. The euphemism landed between them like a body. In her dream, just like in that moment, Zora felt something inside her die. Not her love for him, that would take longer to extinguish, but her illusions,
her belief that the violence was occasional, defensive, something that happened far away in abstract terms. She'd known what Dae-Hyun was, of course. You didn't marry a man called the King of the Empire without understanding there was blood under the crown. But knowing and witnessing were different countries entirely. She'd turned and walked out without another word. He'd called after her, but she'd kept walking, through the hallway, up the elevator, into the penthouse that suddenly felt like a tomb. She'd locked herself in the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. 3 days later, she'd taken a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines that should have been joy, but felt like a prison sentence. 2 weeks after that, she'd found the offshore account he didn't know she knew about, the one she'd discovered by accident months earlier. She'd transferred enough to survive, not enough for him to notice immediately. She'd packed 1 bag. She'd waited until he was at another meeting, probably asking more reasonable questions in that calm voice while someone screamed. And she'd walked away from everything because she'd realized with perfect clarity that she would rather raise her child in poverty than in a palace built on broken bones. Zora woke in the penthouse bedroom, her hand pressed to her racing heart, her belly tight with stress. Dawn was breaking over Seoul, painting the glass towers gold and pink, beautiful and hollow. Somewhere in this building, Dae-Hyun was probably in another meeting, making more necessary decisions, justifying more cruelty in the Empire's name. And she was back in the nightmare she'd fought so hard to escape. The baby kicked, a flutter of movement that felt like protest, like hope, like a question she didn't know how to answer. "I know," she whispered to her unborn child. "I know. I'm sorry." But sorry couldn't undo the past, and it couldn't protect them from what was coming.
It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Dae-Hyun had brought her back. Zora was standing in the kitchen, attempting to make herself eat something, when the pain lanced through her abdomen like lightning, sharp, sudden, stealing her breath. The glass of water slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal shards. She doubled over, one hand clutching the counter, the other pressed to her belly. The baby hadn't moved in hours. She'd noticed earlier but had told herself it was fine, that baby slept, that panic wouldn't help anything. But this pain was different. Wrong. "Zora?" Dae-Hyun's voice came from somewhere behind her, sharp with alarm. She hadn't heard him come in. He was suddenly there, his hands on her shoulders, and for once she didn't pull away because she couldn't. The pain was too consuming. "Something's wrong," she managed, and hated how small her voice sounded. She watched his face transform, watched the controlled mask he always wore crack completely. His eyes went wide, not with anger or frustration like she'd seen 1,000 times, but with something raw and primal. Terror. "Call Dr. Kim," he barked at someone. His security, maybe. She couldn't focus. "Tell him emergency, right now. Send the helicopter to the roof." His hands were shaking as he lifted her, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness she'd forgotten he possessed. "Stay with me, Zora. Just stay with me." The next hour blurred into fragments. The helicopter ride, Dae-Hyun's fan crushing hers, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The private hospital wing, cleared for their arrival. Dr. Kim's calm professional face as he ordered ultrasounds, blood work, monitors. And through it all, Dae-Hyun, the king of the empire who commanded men and moved millions, looking completely helpless. "The baby's heart rate is dropping," Dr. Kim said quietly, and Zora felt the world tilt. "Do something." Dae-Hyun's voice was ragged, nothing like his usual controlled authority. "Whatever it costs, whatever you need, save them both." Time stretched and contracted. Medications through an IV, monitors beeping, Dr. Kim's hands on her belly, pressing, checking. Zora closed her eyes and felt tears slide down her temples into her hair.
She'd spent weeks refusing to engage with Dae-Hyun, treating him like part of the furniture, but now all she could think was that she didn't want to lose this baby, this piece of hope she'd carried through 7 months of running and hiding and rebuilding. "Please," she whispered to gods she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "Please." She felt Dae-Hyun's forehead press against her shoulder, felt his breath coming in uneven gasps. His hand found hers and gripped it like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. "I can't lose you. Either of you. I can't." And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard since before, since the early days when he'd looked at her like salvation instead of possession. Something broken and true. An hour later, Dr. Kim finally spoke the words that made them both breathe again. "The medication is working. Heart rate is stabilizing. It was stress-induced, combined with dehydration and exhaustion. Dangerous, but manageable." He looked at them both with physician's sternness. "She needs rest. Real rest. No stress. No conflict. This baby wants to survive, but you both need to create an environment where that's possible." The words hung in the sterile air like an indictment. When they were alone, Zora finally opened her eyes fully to find Dae-Hyun sitting beside her bedside, his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. She'd never seen him cry, not in all their years together. She wasn't sure he knew how. "I'm sorry," he said without looking up, his voice wrecked. "For all of it, for bringing you back, for the cage, for thinking I could force this to work." He finally raised his head, and his eyes were red-rimmed, devastated. "I told myself I wanted the heir, that this was about legacy and bloodline and empire, but when I thought I was losing you both, I realized—"
He stopped, swallowing hard. Realized what? Zora heard herself ask, and hated that some part of her still cared about the answer. "That I don't give a damn about the empire without you in it." His hand hovered over hers, not quite touching, asking permission. "I don't want an heir. I want our child. I want you to look at me the way you used to, like I was someone worth loving instead of someone to fear." His voice cracked. "I want to be the man you thought you married." Zora stared at him, this powerful man reduced to fragments, and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something, a crack in her own armor. The recognition that his fear had been real, his love buried under empire and violence, but still somehow breathing. "I don't know if that man ever existed," she said softly, "or if you can become him. Let me try." It wasn't a command, it was a plea. "Let me prove that you and this baby matter more than everything else." She didn't answer, couldn't, but she didn't pull her hand away when his finally settled over it, careful and desperate and warm. Outside the hospital window, Seoul glittered in the darkness, the empire spreading out below them like stars. But for the first time since he'd found her, they weren't looking at the city. They were looking at each other. The attack came at dawn, 4 days after the hospital. Zora was in the bedroom when the first explosion shook the penthouse, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows and sending picture frames crashing to the floor. She was dressed before the second blast hit, moving with the calm efficiency she'd learned growing up in neighborhoods where violence was a language everyone spoke. She grabbed the emergency bag she'd packed the day Dae-Hyun brought her back, the one he didn't know about, hidden in the back of the closet. Water, protein bars, first aid kit, cash. She'd learned long ago that hope was a luxury, but preparation was survival. The gunfire started as she moved toward the interior bathroom, the only room without windows. Sharp cracks echoing through the building, mixing with shouts and the wail of alarms. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby shift and turn, restless from her elevated heartbeat, but alive, still alive. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We've survived worse." Outside the bathroom door, she heard Dae-Hyun's voice cutting through the chaos, barking orders in Korean. Footsteps running, more gunshots now, closer. The empire was under siege, and some detached part of her recognized the irony. She'd fled this world to protect her child, and here she was, trapped in the center of exactly what she'd feared. The bathroom door flew open. Dae-Hyun stood there, gun in hand. Blood splattered across his white shirt, though she couldn't tell if it was his. Their eyes met, and he saw him register her calmness, the bag in her hand, the fact that she was already ready to run since the moment he brought her back. "The Zhao Syndicate," he said, voice clipped. "They breached the lower floors. We need to move you to the safe room." "How many floors between us and them?" "4, maybe 3 now." He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but urgently. "Zora, we don't have time." "I'm not running through hallways with gunfire." Her voice was steady, practical. "The bathroom is reinforced, isn't it? You told me once. Bulletproof walls, separate ventilation." He stared at her, and she saw the moment he realized she was right, that she'd been paying attention to details he'd mentioned in passing, cataloging exits and safe points, while he thought she was just his beautiful, passive captive. "Stay here," he said finally. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, and he turned to leave, then stopped, turned back. "You had a bag packed." "Of course I did." "You've been ready to run since the moment I brought you back." "Yes, no point in lying, not with bullets tearing through his empire."
Something crossed his face, pain mixed with understanding. "But you're staying now, in the bathroom. You're not using this chaos to escape." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I'm 8 months pregnant, Dae-Hyun. I'm not running through a war zone. That doesn't mean I've forgiven you." Another explosion, this one making the lights flicker. He nodded once, sharp and military, then was gone, the door closing behind him. Zora locked it, checked the seal, then sat on the floor with her back against the tub, one hand on her belly, the other on the bag. Through the thick walls, she heard it all, the symphony of violence that was Dae-Hyun's inheritance. Gunshots, shouting, bodies hitting floors, the wet sounds of hand-to-hand combat, orders given in that same calm voice he'd used in the interrogation room, the voice that turned killing into administration. This was his world. This was what he'd defended, what he'd called necessary, what he'd chosen over everything else. And now it had come home, bringing death right to their door. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Zora closed her eyes. She thought about the coastal town, about morning light on water, about the small cafe where she'd worked, and people knew her as just Zora, not as anyone's wife or possession. She thought about the life she'd been building, modest and clean and free from the weight of empire. And she thought about Dae-Hyun's face in the hospital, broken and real, saying he wanted to be someone worth loving. 2 hours passed. The gunfire gradually stopped. The shouting faded. She heard Dae-Hyun's voice outside the door saying her name, and only then did she unlock it. He stood there covered in blood and smoke damage, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Behind him, she could see the penthouse destroyed, bullet holes in walls, shattered glass everywhere, overturned furniture, the gifts he'd given her scattered and broken across the floor, diamonds mixed with debris. "It's over," he said. "They're dead or captured." "How many?" Zhao sent 20 men, none of them left. She looked past him at the wreckage, at the physical manifestation of the violence she'd always known existed but had tried to pretend was somewhere else, someone else's problem. "This is what you defend. This is what you call an empire." He followed her gaze, seeing it perhaps for the first time through her eyes, the destruction, the blood, the poison he'd normalized so thoroughly he'd forgotten it was killing him. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what this is." Zora stepped past him, walking through the ruins of the penthouse, her hand never leaving her belly. She stopped at the shattered windows, looking out at Seoul in the morning light, at the city that had no idea what had just happened 70 floors above their heads. "Your world tried to kill our baby today," she said without turning around. "Again, and it will keep trying, Dae-Hyun, because this is what empires do. They consume everything." She heard him move closer, felt him stop just behind her. "You're right." His voice was raw, broken, and for the first time since she'd met him, Kang Dae-Hyun sounded like a man who was finally ready to listen. They moved to a secure location while the penthouse was being cleared and repaired, a safe house in Gangnam, smaller, less ostentatious, but no less a cage. Zora spent 2 days watching Dae-Hyun conduct damage control, phone calls in clipped Korean, meetings with council members who looked at her like she was the reason their fortress had been breached, as if her presence had made them weak. Maybe it had. On the 3rd day, she found him on the rooftop at sunset, souls spreading below them in a grid of lights and shadows. He was smoking, something she'd never seen him do, the cigarette burning between his fingers like a slow fuse. "We need to talk," she said. He turned, and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of maintaining an empire that was trying to tear itself apart. About what happens next.
No. She moved closer, her hand resting on her belly where their child was running out of room to grow. About what happens now. He waited, and she recognized the stillness in him, the way he'd learned to listen in the days since the attack. Not the pretense of listening while planning his next move, but actual listening, the kind that cost him something. "I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital," Zora began, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "About wanting to be someone worth loving, about our child mattering more than the empire. I meant it. I believe you." She paused, gathering the words that would change everything. "But wanting isn't enough, Dae-Hyun. Intentions don't protect our baby from bullets. Good intentions didn't stop the Zhao Syndicate from nearly killing us 3 days ago." His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I've spent these months watching you, seeing how you move through this world, how you justify everything in the name of necessity and legacy and power. And I've realized something." She stepped closer, close enough to see the cigarette smoke curl between them. "You're not a monster because you're cruel. You're a monster because you've made peace with cruelty. You've normalized it so completely that you forgot there was any other way to live." "Zora, I'm not finished." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through his protest. "That night I left, when I saw you in that interrogation room, I didn't leave because I was afraid of you. I left because I was afraid of what our child would become if they grew up thinking that was normal, that violence is just business, that broken bones are just necessary costs." She placed both hands on her belly, as if shielding what lived there from even the idea. "I will not raise a monster's child. I won't let our baby grow up learning that power means brutality, that love means possession, that the world is just a game where the cruelest player wins." The words hung between them like a blade. "What are you saying?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm saying you have a choice." She met his eyes, unflinching. "The Empire or us? You can't have both, Dae-Hyun. Not anymore. Not after everything." She took a breath, steadying herself for what came next. "Either the Empire dies or we do. Not literally," she added, seeing something flash across his face, "but we'll die inside it. Our child will become exactly what you were raised to be, another link in this chain of violence, and I would rather die than watch that happen." Silence. Just the wind and the city and the space between them that felt infinite. "You're asking me to give up everything I've built." His voice was hollow, disbelieving. "Everything my family built. Generations of power and influence. You want me to just walk away?" "No," Zora shook her head. "I'm asking you to choose what matters. I'm asking you to decide if you meant what you said in that hospital, or if those were just words spoken in fear that you'll forget the moment things stabilize." She felt tears building, but refused to let them fall. "You told me you wanted to be the man I thought I married. That man wouldn't raise a child in this poison. That man would burn it all down before he let it consume his family."
Dae-Hyun turned away from her, his hands gripping the rooftop railing so hard his knuckles went white. She could see the war happening inside him, generations of conditioning fighting against the possibility of something different. "They'll never let me walk away," he said finally. "The council, my mother, the other families. Leaving isn't an option in this world. You know that."
"Then don't leave." Her voice was quiet, but absolute. "Dismantle it. Transform it. Turn your shipping empire into something legitimate. Cut ties with the violence, the territory wars, the blood money. You have the power to do it, Dae-Hyun. You've just never had a reason to try." He laughed, a broken sound. "That would take years, maybe a decade. I'd make enemies of everyone I've ever known." "Yes." She moved to stand beside him, looking out at the city. "You would. It would be hard and dangerous, and you might lose everything." She turned to face him, her reflection ghost-like in his dark eyes. "But you'd have us. You'd have a child who grows up knowing their father chose love over power. You'd have a wife who could finally look at you without seeing blood on your hands." She stepped back, giving him space, giving him the weight of the decision. "Think about it," she said. "But don't think too long. Our baby will be here in a month, and I need to know what world we're bringing them into." She moved toward the rooftop door, then paused. "I loved you once, Dae-Hyun. Completely. The kind of love that doesn't die easily. It's still in here somewhere." She touched her chest. "But it's buried under too much pain and too many broken promises. If you want it back, you're going to have to earn it. Not with diamonds or deeds or declarations. With choices. With sacrifice." She left him there on the rooftop, silhouetted against the dying light, and didn't look back. Because this time, the choice was his to make. The purge began on a Monday morning, quiet and surgical, the way Dae-Hyun had learned to execute every operation. But this time, he wasn't building power, he was dismantling it. Park Jin-soo was first, his second in command, the man who'd suggested locking Zora away and taking their child. Dae-Hyun met him in the same underground conference room where the council had condemned his wife, and he came with evidence. Financial records showing embezzlement, proof of deals made with the Zhao syndicate, the same enemies who'd tapped the penthouse. Treason in the Empire's language. "You're setting me up," Park had said, face pale as Dae-Hyun spread the documents across the obsidian table. "I'm giving you a choice," Dae-Hyun replied, his voice empty of emotion. "Resign, leave Seoul, disappear into whatever life you can build far from here. Or I show this to the council, and you know what happens to traitors." Park left on a flight to Singapore that night. One down. The others fell like dominoes over the following weeks. Councilwoman Lee found her offshore accounts frozen and her shipping contracts mysteriously dissolved. She fled to Hong Kong before Dae-Hyun could deliver the final blow. 2 others accepted buyouts, generous enough to rebuild elsewhere, cruel enough to make clear they were being exiled. Another was arrested. Legitimate charges Dae-Hyun had spent years overlooking suddenly filed with prosecutors who owed him favors. He worked methodically, carefully, using every tool the Empire had taught him, but turning them inward. Each council member who'd voted to separate him from Zora, who saw his family as assets to be managed rather than people to be protected, found themselves facing a choice: leave willingly or be destroyed. Zora watched from the safe house, saying nothing as the reports came in, as Dae-Hyun came home each night looking more exhausted, more hollowed out, the empire he'd inherited crumbling piece by piece under his own hands. His mother was last, the matriarch, the woman who'd built as much of the empire as his father had, who'd shaped Dae-Hyun into the weapon he'd become. He met her in her penthouse, the one she'd maintained separately from his, filled with antiques and art purchased with blood money. She was drinking tea when he arrived, as if she'd been expecting this.
"You're destroying everything," she said without preamble. 3 generations of work, and you're burning it down for a woman who left you." "A woman I drove away," Dae-Hyun corrected, sitting across from her. Because you taught me that control was love, and power was safety. I taught you to survive. Her voice was sharp, unrepentant. This world eats the weak, Dae-Hyun. I made you strong. You made me empty. He placed a folder on the table between them. I'm restructuring the empire. Legitimate operations only. The shipping business, the security contracts, everything that can exist in daylight. The rest, the territory, the underground deals, the violence, it ends. She opened the folder, scanning documents that would transform everything. The other families will never accept this. You'll start a war. Then I'll fight it. His voice was steady, final. But I won't raise my child in the world you built. I won't let them grow up thinking that cruelty is strength. That woman has made you soft. No, Dae-Hyun stood, looking down at the woman who'd shaped his entire existence. She made me remember I'm human. He moved toward the door, then paused. You can stay in Seoul. Keep your properties, your accounts, but you're out of the business, and you don't come near my family. If you fight me on this, if you try to undermine what I'm building, I'll treat you like I treated Park, family or not. He saw something flash in her eyes then. Not anger, recognition. She was seeing the lesson she'd taught him turned back on her, the ruthlessness she'd cultivated now cutting her out. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Maybe. He opened the door. But I'd regret the alternative more. The threats started 2 days later. Anonymous warnings, packages delivered to the safe house with photos of Zora, of their planned hospital for the delivery, evidence that the old guard, the families who'd prospered under the empire's violence, weren't going quietly. Dae-Hyun hired private security, legitimate firms with no ties to the underworld. He moved Zora again, to a location even his mother didn't know. He worked 18-hour days, navigating the transformation from criminal empire to legitimate corporation, bleeding money and influence and power with every decision. His fortune shrank, contacts vanished, allies became enemies. Men who'd feared him now saw weakness, saw opportunity. And through it all, Zora watched him destroy himself for her. One night, 3 weeks into the purge, she found him in the study, surrounded by legal documents and financial projections, showing how much he'd lost, how much more he stood to lose. He looked up when she entered, and she saw it in his face, the cost of choosing her. They're saying I'm finished, he said without emotion, that the Kang Empire is dead. Zora moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, the first time she'd willingly been near him in months. Good, she said quietly. Let it die. Let it all burn. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and felt him tremble. Build something new. Build something our child won't have to run from. He turned to look at her, and she saw tears on his face, this man who'd learned never to cry, never to show weakness. I don't know how, he admitted. I only know how to be what they made me. Then learn. She brought his hand to her belly, where their baby was fighting for space, preparing to enter whatever world they created. We'll learn together. For the first time since he'd found her in that coastal town, Dae-Hyun allowed himself to hope that burning down his empire might save his soul. The contraction started at 3 a.m, 6 days after Dae-Hyun had signed the final documents dissolving the council. Zora woke to the tightening, familiar now after weeks of false labor, but different this time. Deeper, insistent, real. Dae-Hyun. She touched his shoulder, and he was awake instantly, years of survival instinct making him alert even in sleep. Is it time? Yes. A contraction rolled through her, stealing her breath. It's time. They'd planned for this. The hospital was secure, a private wing with doctors Dae-Hyun had vetted personally, security that answered to him alone and not to the empire he'd dismantled. But plans meant nothing when her water broke in the car, when the contractions came faster than expected, when their daughter decided she was done waiting. She's coming fast, the doctor said once they reached the hospital, and Zora heard both excitement and concern in her voice. First babies usually take longer, but this one knows what she wants. She's like her mother, Dae-Hyun said, gripping Zora's hand as another contraction peaked and crashed. Stubborn. Strong. Through the pain, Zora almost smiled. The hours blurred together, pain and pressure and the primal work of bringing life into the world. Dae-Hyun stayed beside her, his hand steady in hers, whispering encouragement in Korean and English, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, being present in a way she'd never seen him be for anything. "I can't," she gasped at one point, exhausted, overwhelmed. "I can't do this." "You can." He pressed his forehead to hers, his voice fierce and certain. "You're the strongest person I know. You walked away from everything to protect her. You survived alone. You faced down an empire. This is just one more thing you'll survive." "We," she corrected between contractions. "One more thing we'll survive." And she saw it then, the shift in his eyes, the understanding that he was no longer alone in his choices, no longer the solitary king making unilateral decisions. They were a we now, building something together from the ashes of what he'd destroyed. At dawn, as the first light broke over Seoul, their daughter entered the world screaming, tiny and perfect and furiously alive, her skin a beautiful blend of both her parents, her lungs powerful enough to announce her arrival to anyone listening. "A girl," the doctor said, placing the baby on Zora's chest, "healthy and strong." Zora looked down at her daughter, at this impossible thing she and Dae-Hyun had created, and felt something break open in her chest. Not the careful armor she'd built, but something deeper. Joy. Pure and uncomplicated and overwhelming. "She's beautiful," she whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers, counting them through her tears. "She's perfect." Dae-Hyun stood frozen beside the bed, staring at his daughter like she was something holy. His hands hovered uncertainly, and Zora recognized the fear in his face, the fear of contaminating something pure with everything he'd been. "Hold her," she said softly, adjusting so he could see better. "It's okay." "I don't," his voice cracked. "I don't know how." "Neither do I." Zora smiled, exhausted and radiant. "We'll figure it out." The nurse helped position him, showed him how to support the baby's head, how to cradle her against his chest. And then she was there, in his arms, this tiny life that weighed nothing and everything all at once. Dae-Hyun looked down at his daughter, and Zora watched transformation happen in real time. She saw the empire fall away from his face, saw the armor dissolve, saw the man she'd married, the one she'd believed existed somewhere beneath the violence, finally surface completely. "Hello," he whispered to the baby, his voice breaking. "I'm your father. I'm going to try very hard not to fail you." The baby's eyes opened, dark and unfocused, searching. Her tiny hand found his finger and gripped it with surprising strength. "She's holding on to you," Zora said, her own tears falling freely now. "I know." He couldn't look away from his daughter's face. "I can feel it."
Dae-Hyun. Zora waited until he looked at her. "You're not holding her like she's yours. You're holding her like you're hers." He nodded, understanding the distinction. Not possession, not ownership, not another asset to protect and control, but service, devotion, the kind of love that made you smaller in the best way, that put someone else's existence above your own. "What do we name her?" he asked, still mesmerized by the tiny human in his arms. Zora thought about the coastal town, about morning light on water, about the freedom she'd found and the hope she'd carried. "Amara," she said. "It means eternal, unfading, because some things survive everything." Amara. He tested the name, then smiled, genuine and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen in years. "She'll be better than both of us." "She'll be her own person," Zora corrected, "free to choose who she becomes."
Outside the hospital window, Seoul was waking up. The city that had housed the empire Dae-Hyun had destroyed, the world they'd fought to escape and fought to change. But in this room, in this moment, the city didn't matter. The empire didn't matter. The past even didn't matter. All that mattered was the three of them, a family built from ruins, learning how to be gentle in a world that had taught them both to be hard. Dae-Hyun bent down, carefully, and kissed Amara's forehead. Then he looked at Zora, and in his eyes she saw everything she'd been waiting for. Not ownership, not possession, not the desperate need to control. Just love, simple and true, and finally free. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up the possibility that I could be better." Zora reached up, touching his face, feeling the tears there. "Thank you for becoming the man who deserved the chance." And in the wreckage of an empire, in the space where violence used to live, something new was born. 3 years later, the coastal town looked exactly as Zora remembered it. Weathered porches and wildflower gardens, the salt air carrying the sound of waves and seabirds, the kind of peace that money couldn't manufacture. She stood on the same porch that Dae-Hyun had found her, but everything else was different. "Mama, look!" Zora's voice rang out, pure joy as she chased a butterfly through the garden. 3 years old, all wild curls and unstoppable energy, her father's determination wrapped in her mother's grace. She moved through the world fearlessly, unaware that she'd been born into the ruins of an empire, knowing only the love that had risen from those ashes. Dae-Hyun emerged from inside the cottage carrying a tray with tea and the coconut bread Zora had taught him to make. He'd learned to cook in the years since Amara's birth, learned to do 1,000 ordinary things that his old life had never required. The tattoos on his neck had faded slightly, softened by time and sunlight, no longer declarations of power, but simply part of his history. "She found a butterfly," Zora said, watching their daughter with a smile. "She finds wonder in everything." He set the tray down, settling beside her on the porch swing, not too close, respecting her space, but near enough that their shoulders could touch if either of them leaned in. "Like someone else I know." They'd bought the cottage 6 months ago, a weekend home away from Seoul, away from the legitimate shipping corporation Dae-Hyun had rebuilt from the empire's remains. It was modest by their old standards, just 3 bedrooms and a kitchen that overlooked the sea, but it was theirs in a way the penthouse had never been.
"I've been thinking about that day," Dae-Hyun said quietly, watching Amara play. "When I came here and found you, when I thought bringing you back would solve everything. And instead, it almost destroyed us," Zora finished. "Yes." He turned to look at her, and she saw the years in his face, the lines that hadn't been there before. Not from age, but from change, from the hard work of becoming someone different. "I was so certain I knew what was right, that my control, my power could keep you safe." "You were afraid," Zora said, not unkindly. "Fear makes us stupid." He laughed, soft and genuine. "You've never been afraid to tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it." Someone had to. She reached for her tea, the simple gesture comfortable, familiar. They'd built this over 3 years, this ease with each other. Not the passionate intensity of their early marriage, but something deeper. Partnership. Trust earned through consistent choices rather than grand gestures. Amara ran up to the porch, holding the butterfly she'd caught cupped carefully in her small hands. "Papa, look, can we keep it?" Dae-Hyun knelt down to her level, examining the butterfly with the same seriousness he'd once given empire business. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, but it belongs to the sky, not to us. Sometimes the things we love need to be free." Zora felt her throat tighten, hearing the lesson he'd learned reflected back in how he taught their daughter. Amara considered this, then opened her hands. The butterfly hesitated for just a moment before taking flight, disappearing into the afternoon light. "Bye, butterfly," she called, then immediately spotted something else fascinating and ran off again. "You're good at this," Zora said as Dae-Hyun returned to the swing. "Being a father." "I'm learning." He settled back, and this time when his hand found hers, it was natural, not possessive. Still learning every day. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Amara explore, watching the waves roll in beyond the garden. Seoul felt far away. The legitimate business that occupied Dae-Hyun's weekdays felt far away. Even the past, with all the violence and pain, felt like something that happened to different people. "Do you ever regret it? Everything you gave up? The power, the empire, the fear people had of you?" Dae-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, genuinely considering. "I regret the time it took me to understand what mattered. I regret the pain I caused you. I regret that Amara will grow up knowing her father's history." He squeezed her hand gently. "But regret giving it up? No, never. Even on the hard days? Especially on the hard days." He turned to face her fully, and she saw the truth in his eyes. "I'd rather struggle to be good than succeed at being powerful. I'd rather have these quiet mornings with you and Amara than rule an empire of ghosts." Zora leaned into him, her head finding his shoulder, and felt him relax into the touch. This was intimacy now, these small moments of trust and tenderness, rebuilt piece by careful piece. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, "for choosing differently, for becoming someone who could let the butterfly go. I had a good teacher." He pressed a kiss to her hair, gentle and reverent. "You showed me what strength actually looks like." Amara's laughter drifted up from the garden, mixing with the sound of waves and wind. Above them, the sky was endless and blue, no glass ceilings to contain it. "Mama, Papa, come see the shells." They stood together, Dae-Hyun's hand naturally finding Zora's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of practice. Not a grip meant to hold her in place, but the simple connection of two people choosing, every day, to walk the same path. As they moved toward their daughter, toward the beach beyond the garden, Zora realized that the man walking beside her was exactly who she'd asked him to become. Not perfect, still carrying scars from who he'd been, but present, gentle, free from the weight of empire. He was no longer reaching for her out of fear or possession. He was walking beside her, equal, partner, home. And that, she thought as Amara grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the water, laughing with the pure joy of a child who knew only love, that was everything she'd ever wanted. The empire was dead, but they were alive. And finally, they were free.